Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Pablo Vieira. I am the Global Director of the Support Unit of the NDC Partnership. Let me start with some housekeeping before we get started. We have interpretation into French and Spanish today. Please use the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select your language. Today's session is being recorded. We will share the recording on our YouTube, and we will share also the PPT with those who registered for today's event. And we're holding the session in webinar format, which means attendees have their microphones muted. But we welcome you introducing yourselves in the chat and share any questions, any comments to our presenters via the Q&A function. So with that, let's get started. This webinar marks the launch of our 2023 Enhancement Webinar Series, Raising Ambition Through Partnerships, which is co-hosted by the NDC Partnership, GIZ, UNDP, and WRI. Each month, we will invite a different partner to share their insights on mitigation and adaptation efforts by highlighting critical topics across gender equality, just transition, sectoral solutions, investment planning, and much more. This webinar series will create a platform for partner dialogue that will promote knowledge and learning exchange to amplify our collective impact and raise ambition through strong implementation between formal UNFCCC NDC cycles. I'm very pleased to introduce today's webinar on aligning NDC enhancement and long-term climate action, co-led by 2050's Pathway Platform. I'd like to start today's session with a brief note on the importance of LT-LEDS and NDC alignment, update, and enhancement. We are on the doorstep of the 1.5 degrees C threshold. The IPCC's sixth assessment report shows emission pathways would need to peak by 2025, just in 2 years, to avoid overshooting this goal. Even if countries meet their current NDC commitments, there would still be a gap between 19 and 26 gigatons of CO2 emissions reductions that would be needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030. We need innovative partnerships, widespread system change, and an increase in climate ambition across the board. Raising climate ambition requires aligning the policies in our toolkit, including most critically the long-term strategies, the LT-LEDS, and the NDCs, and both need to be aligned with our development strategies. Credible emission reductions at the scale needed require transformational shifts in policy and investment. Tweaks and adjustments will not be enough. Launching these transitions requires countries to understand the weight policy implications and related reforms, identify finance needs, and develop enabling frameworks to mobilize investment. To support these efforts, at the end of 2022, the NDC Partnership launched its thematic call on NDC and LT-LEDS alignment, enhancement, and update to foster alignment between the two instruments and develop capacities for their sustained updating and implementation. Efforts will focus on supporting the development and refining of LT-LEDS and on aligning them with short-term and mid-term development planning to unlock NDC ambition. To start today's event, I'd like to welcome Amanda McKee, Director of Knowledge and Learning for the NDC Partnership, who will give a brief overview of her past work on NDC enhancement and the partnership thematic call. Following this, we will hear from Siddharth Pathak and Saskia Gertsen from 2050 Pathways Platform on how, what, and why of LT-LEDS and NDC alignment. With this, let me say once again, thank you for joining us. And please do enjoy this webinar, the first of a series of ones, and let us know what you think. Ask questions so that we can make it as interactive as possible. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it to you, Amanda.
Great. Thank you, Pablo. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be kicking off this first webinar in the series, really to set the framework for the discussion that we're going to have over the next year. We wanted to do a little bit of a reflection on where we've come from, specifically with the NDC update, and how we've seen countries raise their ambition So I'm going to give a really short presentation before turning it over to our colleagues at 2050 Pathways to talk about the links to LT-LEDS, and how we can look at alignment, and how we can avoid misalignment. So I'm going to, we'll be sharing a screen here in a moment, showing you our website, which you can find at enhancement.ndcpartnership.org. And what I'm showing you here are some insights on how NDC partnership countries have updated and enhanced their 2020 NDCs, and some of the valuable takeaways that we can use to approach the next round of NDC updates, but also approach alignment with LT-LEDS. So in 2019, the partnership launched our Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP, as we call it, to provide countries with dedicated support to enhance the quality, the process, and the ambition of their NDCs as part of their update process. And 67 countries in total received support through this initiative, both technical and financial support, drawing from 46 of our partners. These partners brought together a really diverse set of skills and expertise to provide coordinated support to really help countries to ratchet up their implementation and ambition in a variety of ways. And so based on the support that was provided, we carried out an analysis on where countries were most successful in enhancing their NDCs. And we defined enhancement specifically as improvements in NDC ambition, quality, or process, with the improvements to quality and process being critical to create the enabling environments for countries to effectively ratchet up ambition. And so we evaluated NDCs by comparing a country's first NDC to their updated or second NDC and looking at where there were enhancements. And then these observed enhancements were mapped against the support that NDC partnership members had provided to countries. So the first thing to note is that NDC enhancement is multifaceted. And so, as I mentioned, the first way that we can look at enhancement is around improvements to NDC quality. So enhancements that we saw were made through data and modeling support, costing, implementation, planning, and coordination. So to give you an example, Cambodia included costed actions in their NDC, which was paired with detailed information on the implementing entity, the co-benefits, existing technological capabilities, and gender considerations. And so by enhancing NDC quality, countries were left with a stronger foundation for supporting the implementation and ensuring that there was credible and realistic, or there could be credible and realistic financing of targets and plans. The second way that we observed enhancement was around the process for developing and communicating the NDC. And so process includes communicating the NDC transparently, which requires an inclusive revision process with meaningful engagement from diverse stakeholders. And NDC processes are also important reflections of government ownership, ensuring that the NDC accurately reflects national priorities, capacities, and needs, but also draws in different sectoral ministries or different levels of government that will be critical to the implementation. So this included, for instance, alignment with ICTU guidance. It included considerations around the distributional impacts of commitments and associated policies for vulnerable groups. It included public engagement and capacity building. And an example of this was in Indonesia, where as part of the NDC development and rollout process, the government designed a consultation process, which involved seminars and workshops to validate the NDC with civil society, but also to build capacity and mobilize local government and the private sector ultimately for the implementation, which would need to come next. And in Costa Rica, we saw a really interesting example where the government engaged non-traditional stakeholders, including the artistic communities or journalists, through innovative communication campaigns. And the third way that we looked at enhancement was around the actual increases in ambition. And so improvements in NDC quality and the underlying processes helped enable countries to strengthen both their mitigation and adaptation targets. And we saw ambition being raised in various ways. So this could be by setting more ambitious emission reduction targets. It could be by expanding the coverage through different sectors or through different gases, or by elaborating on the specific measures that would be required to actually achieve those targets. And so one of the really interesting findings that we saw through this analysis is that there was a link between countries putting in place unconditional NDCs, so committing to do more irregardless of the support that was coming from international sources, but also raising ambition at the same time. And so of the 24 countries that expanded their unconditional targets, 23 of them also expanded or increased their emission reduction targets. And so it's not that one improvement or one increase in ambition is coming at the expense of other, but countries are really looking at realistically and credibly increasing their ambition. So I want to jump and look ahead to the linkages to LT-LEDS, or long-term low emission development strategies. And we will, through the NDC partnership, be continuing to support countries to strengthen their implementation efforts, but looking ahead now to the development of LT-LEDS and also future NDC updates. And not only do we need to carry forward some of these best practices to update and enhance climate action, but we need to align these efforts to ensure that the limited government capacity that exists is used efficiently and that co-benefits are deliberately sought out. So we're already seeing examples of alignment. We've seen widespread alignment with NDC targets and the SDGs. So all except one of the countries that we analyzed showed enhancement through this wider alignment between their NDC target and sustainable development. And not only does this improvement, or does this improve consistency in implementation, but identifying similar objectives and targets between the two commitments can help to increase the efficiency in reporting, which is really critical for a capacity-constrained country and saves time and saves resources. So to build on these efforts around enhancement and alignment, late last year, the partnership launched its thematic call focused on alignment, update, and enhancement of NDCs and LT-LEDS. And through this call, there are 2 tracks of support that countries can request and can receive. And the first is around developing and updating LT-LEDS. And this includes everything from the beginning stages of crafting a vision and strategy for long-term low emission and climate resilient development, understanding the benefits, the challenges, the trade-offs, but all the way to putting in place actionable policies and plans to actually kickstart this development transition in a fair and sustainable manner. The second track is around enhancing and raising the ambition of updates to NDCs and really fostering this alignment with the LT-LEDS that many countries are starting to develop now. So allowing for timely submission of the NDCs due to the UNFCCC in 2025, but also ensuring that that's done not as a parallel and separate track to the LT-LEDS, but really done in tandem. So support for both of these tracks will be delivered through NDC partnership members. And so with that, to really kick off our series, we're delighted to have 2050 Pathways with us today, leading this session. And so I'm going to hand it over to Siddharth to introduce key concepts around the what, the how, the why of LT-LEDS, and explore NDC and LT-LEDS policy alignment. And so as a reminder, you can submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar in the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that. We'll respond to questions there, but we'll also take some time for questions at the end. And so with that, Siddharth, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Pablo, and apologies if a cat sort of comes in and out of this in the screen. It's, yeah. But thanks a lot for having me. And I think that within the presentation that you did, Amanda, on the enhancement for NDCs, there are already so many similarities that you can see between the processes of developing a long-term strategy as well as the NDC, and the sort of constraints on capacity, funding, technical expertise that can be faced across the two sort of policy instruments in itself. I'm Siddharth. I work for the 2050 Pathways platform as the Director for Partnerships. And I will try and go through some of the elements of the long-term strategy, what makes it distinct from the NDC, but also try and come back on the question of alignment in a way that hopefully gives you a little more insight into what, where are the sort of specific areas that we could potentially work on together. And if you have any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A. And as Amanda said, if there are specific points that you'd want to come in on, I think at one point of time near the end, you could potentially do that also. Next slide, please. So, sorry, if you can go to the next one. So, as Pablo also said, I was meant to be joined by my colleague Saskia. She unfortunately can't make it. Next one, please. Further down. Perfect. So I think the foundations for long-term strategies basically comes from the 1.5 report that was launched. I think that was the report that catalyzed a lot of the conversation around long-term stabilization goals, if we are to keep within the 1.5 trajectory. And those goals, of course, got embedded within the Paris Agreement as part of a call to countries to develop their long-term strategies in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the 2050 Pathways platform was created primarily with that intention to support countries on their effort to develop these long-term strategies, particularly by helping with some of the best practices and having that sort of an exchange amongst countries, as this journey for most countries in as we have seen is pretty much a new journey that they haven't taken before. Next slide, please. So primarily the long-term strategies were to be communicated by COP26. Many of the countries, around 57, have already submitted their long-term strategies, and quite a few of them are also developing their long-term strategies to now in order to either revise them or sort of do them afresh because there are changed circumstances or they have committed to a more ambitious target in the long run. Next slide, please. So primarily, why are long-term strategies important and why are they slightly different, or why are they different from the NDCs? As we've seen, the Paris Agreement requires countries to make strong commitments in the shorter run to get the ball rolling on climate ambition. But there are also long-term goals within the Paris Agreement that need to be met. Those long-term goals require a sort of planned transformation in economies within different economies and within different circumstances. And though that planned transformation requires a lot more time. That is the sort of logic for a 2050 horizon, besides the fact that, of course, by that time, we need the world and the emissions across the world to be at a certain level in order to meet the 1.5 trajectory. There is, of course, a lot that is needed for this transformation in the shorter run. And I think that's where the interplay between the NDCs and the long-term strategy comes into play. There is also a lot of focus on how there could be policy cohesiveness when you're looking at planning for the future and planning for a transformation. Next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So what do we mean when it looks at a net zero transformation, and what does a net zero transformation mean for a particular country? I think it would be a great thing to just sort of pause for maybe 15 seconds to just think of questions, if you have any in relation to this, or if you want to use the chat function to just drop in questions. I saw some, but primarily looking at the fact that if you are to look at a net zero transformation in the long run, how does that transformation interplay with the climate change policy objectives as well as the socio-economic objectives of the countries, alongside a very critical dimension of aspirations, especially for developing countries, where it's not just about meeting the bare minimum standards of development, but aspiring to be a far, far more developed economy than they are currently. I think the other big sort of thing to probably give a bit of a silent reflection on is the sort of long-term sectoral changes that are to be anticipated when you're looking at a net zero, and how do these objectives, or how in some sectors they might be slightly different from the short-term policies that are activated by the NDC. So I might just sort of stop for 10 seconds and get people, we would have had more time, but it's better to just at least take some time if people have questions to put in the Q&A, or if they want to put any other reflections within the functions in itself. So I'll probably take a pause for 10 seconds and then start off onto the next slide. All right, so just in case if you've had any thoughts or any sort of reflections, do feel free to put them in. Next slide, please. If you go to the next one, a big sort of dimension of the long-term strategy is, of course, some of the core components of what exactly is within a long-term strategy. A big part of our focus within the platform for many of the countries is on a vision for the long run, whether it's 2050, in some cases it's further, in some cases it's nearer, but a long-term vision which actually takes into account, like I said, the socio-economic goals, the development objectives, as well as the aspirations of a country, along with the need to sort of get to a certain emission levels, whether it's net zero. In most country cases now that's the case, but I cannot say that it's a shared objective across all countries. And also sort of looking at it in a multidimensional way of what a vision like that would look at in terms of my country context. I think the other sort of key component for a long-term strategy, of course, is looking at some of these scenarios. And these scenarios will, of course, draw from the vision in itself, but will also look at some of the underlying economic as well as macroeconomic indications within the country context as well. The other bit is, of course, around the stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement in a whole of government, whole of society approach is very critical within the long-term strategy process. Like I said, a transformation within a country's economy is not a straight-jacketed task. It requires an approach that can actually be across different stakeholders, as well as informing the public of what is really needed. There are some tough questions that come up, and it's important to bring in and build consensus around those. So stakeholder engagement during the development and over the course of the process, as well as after, is quite critical in order for successful development of a long-term strategy. Finally, of course, there is a policy framework of governance, which connects back to a certain degree with the stakeholder engagement, but there are also elements of operationalization of the long-term strategy. And this is an element that sort of interacts with the NDC. Finally, I think it's the periodic revisions. Like I said, there are assumptions that change, technology is changing. There are many things because you're projecting over a course of nearly 30 years or so, there are new developments that can be taken into account, and thus we sort of recommend that there should be a point of time in the future that you revise these long-term strategies in a spirit of looking at some of these assumptions and looking at some of the changes that have happened. Next slide, please. So, like I said, I think it's really important, and this sort of graphic sort of speaks to that. It's really important to know where you're headed. And I think quite a lot of times there is a sort of a need to step back and think about what is that sort of direction of travel that we are going to take as a country, or we are going to take as a government, in order to get to whatever objectives that I have in the future. And we have seen this sort of a situation where misalignment starts happening, especially around ambition, where shorter term policies are designed in a certain way while longer term policies are designed slightly differently. Next slide, please. So I'll stress on this again, and I think that's quite clear that vision for us is quite the central underpinning within the long-term strategy. The vision, of course, includes what has been done in the NDC, but also looks at some of the socioeconomic aspirations as well as the climate goals. And it is a bit of an amalgamation of all of these three. Thanks. You can actually go to the next slide. So the key topics that we have seen that are generally covered in most of the long-term strategies that have been submitted to the UNFCCC, there's of course a vision. There are also elements of a scenario, whether in many cases these are net zero scenarios, but there are also projections that have been developed which are not necessarily geared towards net zero. There is increasing number of countries that are including adaptation and resilience within their long-term strategy, and that, of course, unfortunately, there is no global goal around it as of now. But the more we can consistently see that countries are refining their approach in the long run around adaptation and resilience in relation to the long-term strategy. There are, in many cases, implications of just transition. This question is not entirely answered in many of the long-term strategies, but I think the long-term strategies start bringing up or identifying some of those core areas where a country might require a more dedicated sort of conversation on how that transition is going to be undertaken. What are the sort of elements of that transition that need to be figured out? Then there is, of course, elements around implication on the national policy and regulatory framework, as well as, in many cases, the governance, as well as what are the roles and responsibilities within the long-term strategy process in itself. Next slide, please. So I think we are nearly there, and I think a big part of aligning the long and the short term is also about, like I said, the long-term horizon for some of these plans and some of these questions. I think what I wanted to try and also stress is that after the most recent conclusion of the COP around the CBD, there is also a question of alignments around the biodiversity plans that are there at the country level. So there are a lot of targets and plans that need to be aligned in the near as well as the longer term in order for the governments to effectively see where the synergies are. And I think the NBSAPs, which are for the CBD, are also equally important as the long-term strategies, as the NDCs, as well as the SDGs in itself. I think in our experience, we've seen, and I'll sort of stop there. In our experience, we've seen misalignment mostly, or a question of alignment around three sort of pillars. And one of it is ambition, where countries have developed certain short-term policies and NDCs that are not necessarily aligned to their long-term goals, which could be net zero in many cases, or they don't necessarily speak to each other. There's also a bit of a misalignment on the analytical sort of underpinning of these strategies as well as the NDCs, because there is a quantitative modeling that is done for both. In many cases, there are some assumptions that are not shared. So results are not necessarily compatible with each other. That's another sort of area that we've seen in many cases. And finally, I think governance. And of course, it's not a very sort of a small word, but there is a large area where policies or as well as institutions are not necessarily geared to address the short and the long term simultaneously. So that's the other sort of key area that we've seen very sort of that puts into question the dimension of alignment in itself. I'll stop there. And if, of course, there are questions, I'm happy to answer them on the chat as well as in the space. And I'll pass it on to the NDC Partnership support. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Very grateful for your intervention today. I would just like to start by noting, please everyone submit any questions that you may have to the Q&A function. We're also welcome you introducing yourselves to one another in the chat. We are leaving space during today's session for your questions, so please make sure that you submit them. And we're excited to hear from you. One question that we received in the chat was, beyond supporting the development of long-term strategies, what other support do we provide as NDC Partnership? And our colleague Fernando has responded to this in the chat, but I will also mention that we are currently, as NDC Partnership, supporting work through our thematic call, which supports member countries in developing their long-term strategies, updating, aligning, and enhancing the ambition of their NDCs and LT-LEDs, and then implementing those LT-LEDs. The thematic call, as Pablo and Amanda mentioned earlier, is already in its initial stages. It was launched at COP27, and it has a main goal of supporting NDC Partnership member countries in preparing and updating and refining their long-term low-emission development strategies, and increasing the ambition of their NDCs and ensuring that these are aligned. So a huge thank you to Siddharth for going over the key components of the long-term strategies today. And up to this month, we've seen 32 countries showing interest in receiving support from the initiative. And we are currently in the process of receiving pre-screening forms and expressions of interest from members. If you are interested and a member of the partnership, please contact us at thematic@ndcpartnership.org for those countries who are seeking support through the thematic call. We're very pleased to be holding this series in collaboration with GIZ, UNDP, and WRI. And our next session will be on integrating gender into NDCs and long-term low-emission development strategies. So please keep an eye out for the registration link for that. We will share it in the follow-up email to this session. If anybody has questions, please submit them to the chat for us to answer, and we can continue that way. But Siddharth, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or how participants might best follow up with you for any questions?
Thanks. So I think in general, nothing really to add as of now, but I do think that it is quite critical for countries to think of both these instruments, and like I said, even the biodiversity plans in sort of tandem, because as we are getting into implementation and operationalization, there is already, of course, a sense of how finance is going to be targeted or how finance is going to be used towards operationalizing some of these. And that's where the bigger question of alignment, I think, for many developing countries starts coming up, where there isn't enough finance in the system to actually support all three. So if the more aligned plans are on the ground, the more likelihood that they are relatively easily financed, or at least there is finance that is more efficiently used in that sense. So I think that is another reason, or another sort of important reason why alignment is quite critical across many of these policies at the national level in itself. And in terms of reaching out to us, I think for the platform, I can drop in my email on the chat. I realized that it was not on the PowerPoint, but in case that's helpful, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are specific ones.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for your participation in today's session. And thank you all for joining the event today. I encourage you to visit our website, where if you view the events page, you can see the upcoming sessions in the series, which we will be scheduling on a monthly basis. So keep an eye out for those. And in the follow-up email, we will also be sure to share the registration link for our next session. Amanda, I see that you've come back on video. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just before we close, I wanted to kind of reiterated a few points on how countries and partners can further engage. So as Jamie mentioned, and as was mentioned in the chat as well, the partnership and its members are here and available to provide support. And so what we've done through this thematic call is we'll be helping countries to think through how they can approach their LT-LEDS development or update and their NDC update in tandem. So ensuring that they're aligning those two processes and taking advantages of opportunities to do things at the same time. In addition, we have our normal way of engaging with countries. And so we encourage any of our country members to reach out at any time and ask questions or discuss with our country engagement team if you have specific requests for support. And then the last thing is for our implementing partners who are on the line, we really want to use this webinar series as a way to share and communicate some of the best practices on things that worked well through the last NDC update process that we can build off of and we can learn from. So if you're interested in engaging, if you're interested in working together with us on a session, please reach out to us. As we mentioned, we're really excited to be co-hosting this entire series with GIZ, UNDP, and WRI. But each session will be hosted by a different partner to showcase some of the unique insights and expertise that partners have been bringing to the table. So I just wanted to end with that last offer and to say thank you for everyone for joining us for today's webinar.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you all for attending. A huge thank you to 2050 Pathways platform for joining and co-hosting today's session. I hope that you all have a lovely rest of your day and a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.